It began like all forbidden stories do, not with thunder but with silence. Julia stood by the window of the lake house, her hands clasped tightly around a chipped mug of coffee she hadn't sipped in 10 minutes. The August wind rippled the surface of the water like secrets stirred beneath stillness, and she told herself she wasn't waiting. Not for footsteps, not for the creak of floorboards, not for the voice she'd memorized better than her own. Her husband, Matthew, was downstairs fixing the fence like he did every summer since they bought the property, too loyal to notice anything, too kind to ever suspect what she and his brother were doing when the sun dipped behind the trees and the air turned thick with temptation. It hadn't started with love. It hadn't even started with lust. It started with grief, and grief is a greedy thing. 6 months ago, Julia lost their child, 8 weeks old, not even a name, just a cluster of cells and hope. And it was Nathan, not Matthew, who held her while she cried. Nathan, the younger brother, the one who never settled, never married, who always seemed like a shadow of Matthew until the night he wasn't. That night had been soft and terrible. Rain tapping the roof like questions. Her sobs had turned to silence, and Nathan's hand stayed on her back longer than it should have. They hadn't meant to kiss. But once they did, everything afterward felt inevitable, like falling. Now 2 months later she couldn't look at Matthew without guilt blooming inside her like bruises. He still touched her like she was whole. He still whispered "I love you" like nothing was broken. And now, standing by the window, her hand instinctively brushed her lower belly. Already a little firm. She hadn't told anyone. Not even Nathan. Not even herself, really. But she knew the way a storm knows thunder before the sky splits. The test she took alone in the grocery store bathroom. 2 lines. Sharp, pink, undeniable. And it was Nathan's. It had to be. She hadn't been with Matthew since the miscarriage. He'd given her space. Too much space. The kind where someone else could slip in. And now she stood with a life inside her and a lie growing faster than truth. That afternoon Nathan came up behind her. No sound. Just presence. The kind that changed the air. "You okay?" he said, his voice low, dangerous in its softness. She didn't turn. "No," she answered, finally sipping the cold coffee, bitter and necessary. "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed wasn't silent at all. It screamed. Nathan stepped back like the words had pushed him. "Is it?" He stopped. He didn't have to ask, and then came the question that would define the rest of their lives. "What are we going to do?" Nathan didn't speak for a long time. His face was pale, but not with fear, with calculation, with something turning behind his eyes. Some painful thought trying to find the least damaging path forward in a landscape where every direction led to ruin. Julia watched him, her heart thudding like a drum in a funeral procession, because she knew what he was thinking. She was thinking it too. There was no version of this story that ended without someone breaking. "We could leave," he said finally, and even as he said it, he flinched as if afraid of hearing the words aloud. Julia shook her head, her grip tightening on the mug. "He's your brother, Nathan." The sentence hung in the room like smoke. Nathan leaned against the counter, arms crossed, voice low. "You think he won't find out eventually? You think this baby's going to come out and look like him?" His laugh was short and without humor. "We're not that different, but we're different enough. He'll see it, maybe not at first, but one day he will." Julia pressed her fingers to her forehead. Her skin was cold. She hadn't cried since the miscarriage. Not really. But something about this moment, this awful real moment, made her feel like cracking open again. "I never meant for this to happen," she whispered, which felt like the stupidest sentence a human being could say. "Because things don't just happen. You let them. And sometimes you pay for them." "Neither did I," Nathan said, and there was something real in his voice, something almost childlike. "But it did." A door closed downstairs. Heavy boots on the stairs. Julia's eyes widened. "Go," she mouthed, and Nathan was already moving toward the guest room as Matthew's voice echoed up the hallway. "Jules," he called. "You want lunch?" Julia wiped her face quickly, straightened, smiled with everything she had left. "Yeah," she called back, "coming." They ate grilled cheese sandwiches on the back porch, the kind Matthew always made a little too burnt but never stopped calling perfect. He told her about the fence, about the neighbor's new dog, about a podcast he was listening to on survival stories. "You'd love it," he said, passing her a glass of lemonade. "This guy fell off a mountain, shattered his legs, still dragged himself 4 miles back to camp." Julia nodded, sipping carefully. The lemonade tasted sour. Everything did now. Sounds like a miracle, she said. Matthew smiled, that easy smile she used to trust. Sometimes that's all it takes, right? Just holding on. She looked at him, really looked, and saw the man she'd married. The man who kissed her shoulder in the mornings, who danced badly in the kitchen when he thought no one was looking, who believed in fixing things, even when they were beyond repair. And she realized something horrifying and pure. She still loved him. Not with the same fire that burned with Nathan. That was different. That was danger and want in the edge of a blade. But Matthew was home. And now she'd set fire to it. That night she lay beside him in bed, his breath soft and rhythmic, arm curled loosely around her waist, and she wanted to disappear. She wanted to crawl out of her own skin and escape the timeline where everything had gone wrong. In the dark, her hand slipped down to her belly again. The curve was still small. Secret. A countdown. In her dreams, she heard a child crying. She couldn't tell whose it was. The days passed like slow poison. Nathan avoided her mostly. When he did look at her, it was with that same tortured guilt in his eyes, like a man drowning quietly in a room full of air. Julia tried to act normal, to laugh at Matthew's jokes, to cook dinner without trembling, but the truth pressed harder with each passing day. At night she whispered to the ceiling, "What should I do?" But no answer came. Just the creak of wood. The shuffle of time. The pregnancy was harder to hide than she expected. She stopped drinking wine at dinner. She started wearing loose clothes. Matthew noticed. One morning he touched her stomach and said, "You've been quiet lately. Are you okay?" And she almost confessed. Right there, let it spill out like blood, but she didn't know how. So she smiled and said she was fine and changed the subject to the weather. 3 weeks later the truth broke the surface. Not from her but from a shattered phone screen. Julia had left her phone in the kitchen. Nathan had texted, "We need to talk. I can't keep doing this." The message lit up as Matthew walked in to grab a drink. He saw it, his brother. That sentence, it didn't take a genius. Julia came down 5 minutes later and found Matthew standing there, phone in hand, staring like a man staring at the end of something. "What is this?" he asked, his voice hollow, his hands trembling. And she said the only thing she could, the truth. The silence after her confession wasn't silence at all. It was a screaming void, the kind that swallows sound and breath and time. Matthew stood motionless, his hand still holding her phone like it was a weapon or a relic from another life. Julia didn't cry, not at first. She watched him, waiting for the outburst, for the shattering, but what came instead was worse. Nothing. He blinked once. Twice. Then placed the phone gently on the counter and walked out of the room. Not a word. Not a sigh. Just footsteps on tile, fading. She followed him. "Matthew," she called softly, "please say something." But he kept walking, through the hallway, past the stairs, out the front door into the twilight, where the wind stirred the trees and the lake shimmered with cold indifference. Julia stood in the doorway, barefoot on the wooden porch, watching the man she loved dissolve into dusk. She wanted to chase him, but part of her knew. There was no catching someone who's just realized they've been living inside a lie. He didn't come home that night. Or the next. His car was gone. His things untouched. Nathan too disappeared, whether out of guilt or shame or some sense of decency she didn't know. She was alone in the house with the weight of 2 absences and 1 growing life inside her. Her stomach turned not with morning sickness but dread. What had she done? What had she broken that could never be fixed? On the 3rd morning Matthew returned. He looked older. Like someone who had walked through fire and made it out but left pieces of himself behind. He didn't speak at first. Just stood in the kitchen looking at the place where she used to make coffee. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw tight. Julia approached him like one might approach a wounded animal. "Matthew," she whispered, "please, talk to me." His voice when it came was raw. "How long?" He swallowed. "Since the miscarriage." Pause. "Once. Twice. I don't even know what it was. I was broken." "And you ran to him," Matthew said, not a question, just an echo. Julia reached for him, but he flinched. "Don't," he said, backing away like her touch burned. "Just tell me one thing and be honest. Is the baby his?" She nodded slowly. Matthew stared at her for a long time, then sat down at the table, burying his face in his hands. She stood helpless, watching the man she'd betrayed try to breathe through a pain she had given him like a gift wrapped in glass. They talked for hours. Or maybe minutes. Time didn't mean much anymore. He asked questions she didn't want to answer. She answered them anyway. She told him everything. She told him she still loved him. That she wished it hadn't happened. That she hadn't stopped loving him, not even for a second. But you did stop needing me, he said quietly. And you needed him. The truth of that stung in a way nothing else had. Because yes, she had needed Nathan, but not the way she needed Matthew now. Not with that same quiet desperation, that aching regret. It wasn't love, she said. With Nathan. It wasn't real. It was pain wearing a different face. But Matthew just looked at her with those hollow eyes and said, real or not, it still made a child. That night he slept in the guest room. The next day Julia woke up to find a note on the table. Matthew's handwriting. I need time. I don't know what I'm going to do yet. But I'm not going to abandon you. Or the baby. I just can't look at you right now, I'm sorry. She read it twice. 3 times. Then folded it neatly and pressed it to her chest like a wound. Nathan came back 3 weeks later. No phone call. No warning. Just the low hum of his car pulling into the driveway like thunder trying to apologize. Julia saw him from the window, hand resting on her growing belly, the silence inside her louder now than any words he could speak. She didn't move, not until the knock came. A single dull echo on the door. She opened it slowly. He stood there with the same eyes, Matthew's eyes, but colder, more tired, a touch ashamed. He looked thinner, like guilt had been feeding on him. I had to see you, he said. His voice cracked like a bridge buckling. Julia didn't answer. She just stepped aside and let him in because she didn't have the strength to keep him out, not anymore. The house felt heavier with him inside. Like the walls remembered everything. He sat down at the edge of the couch like a stranger visiting a crime scene. Where is he? Nathan asked. Gone, Julia said. He comes and goes. Nathan looked down at his hands. I didn't mean for this. Any of it. Julia crossed her arms. You didn't stop it either. That landed like a slap. Do you regret it? He asked. She didn't speak at first. Then, I regret what it did. To him. To us. Nathan nodded. And the baby? A long silence. I don't regret this baby, she said. I don't know what that makes me, but I don't. He looked at her stomach like it was both a miracle and a verdict. I never wanted to hurt my brother, Nathan said. But I've wanted you for longer than I'd ever admit. Julia turned away. Don't say that. Not now. He's never going to forgive us. I know. So what now? He asked. Julia closed her eyes. You disappear again, you let me fix this. But Nathan didn't move. I want to be part of the child's life. Julia froze. You think that's your right? It's not about rights, he said. It's about responsibility. About blood. Don't talk to me about blood, she snapped. You already ruined one family. You want to pretend we can make another out of the pieces. He looked like he wanted to speak, to argue, to plead, but the words never came. Just a quiet, defeated step back. If he lets you raise that child as yours, Nathan said, you think you'll ever sleep again? Knowing it's mine? The silence was thick and hot, like summer thunder right before the storm breaks. She walked to the door and opened it. Leave Nathan. And don't come back unless he asks for you. He stared at her like he wanted to remember everything. Then he left. No goodbyes. Just the sound of a car driving away from a life it helped destroy. Later that night Matthew returned. Rain clung to him like a second skin. He didn't say anything at first, just stood in the hallway watching her. Watching the curve of her belly. The storm behind him framed him in flashes of white and shadow. He came back, Julia said. I sent him away. Matthew nodded. I saw his car down the road. His voice was distant. I didn't stop. She walked to him slowly, afraid the floor might collapse under the weight of her hope. I told him he has no place here. That you decide what happens now. Matthew looked at her, and for the first time in weeks, something flickered behind his eyes. Not love maybe, but something close to recognition. It's my child now, he said softly but firmly. If I stay, it's mine. No questions. No DNA tests, no shared custody, it's mine. Julia's voice cracked as she said, yes. But inside her something twisted. Because the truth was still there, buried beneath all the love and grief and bargaining. a truth with a heartbeat and a face that might one day resemble his uncle's more than his father's. They called her Ella. A name chosen in a moment of fragile peace, between hospital walls painted with soft pastels and machines that hummed like lullabies. When Matthew first held her, he didn't see betrayal, he saw beginnings. Tiny fingers curled around his as if she'd chosen him. As if the blood in her veins didn't matter. Julia watched him, exhaustion carved into her face, but also awe. And fear. Because with each tender kiss he placed on Ella's forehead, the lie grew bigger. He had accepted the child, yes. But would he ever truly forget the shadow behind her eyes? The first months were delicate. Julia and Matthew became something new, partners in silence. They co-parented with choreographed grace, spoke in soft tones, moved like glass around each other. At night they took turns with the baby. Julia often found Matthew standing over the crib, unmoving, just watching Ella breathe. "She's perfect," he would whisper, and sometimes she believed he meant it. Other nights she'd catch him staring at Nathan's old football trophies in the den, and her heart would ice over. Nathan, true to her demand, stayed away. No messages. No visits. It was better that way, cleaner. But clean didn't mean pure. Julia still woke from dreams where the two brothers stood on opposite sides of a bridge, and she stood in the middle, holding a child neither would claim aloud. In those dreams the bridge always collapsed. 6 months in, Matthew came home late from work. He was quiet, distracted. Julia noticed. She always noticed. "Something wrong?" she asked. He looked at her too long before answering. "I ran into Nathan." Her breath caught. "Did he speak to you?" "No, just looked. Then walked away." "And how did it feel?" she asked, voice barely a whisper. "Like looking in a mirror I'd rather break." That night they made love for the first time since before everything. It was tender. Desperate. Almost apologetic. And when it was over, Julia cried into his chest. Not because it hurt, but because it didn't. Because for a moment it felt like before. And nothing scared her more than the illusion that it still could. They settled into a rhythm. Ella grew fast. Faster than time should allow. She laughed like Matthew but furrowed her brow like Nathan. And every time she did, Julia's stomach turned. But she said nothing. She had made her choice, Matthew. They had chosen the lie. And for a while it worked. Until Ella's second birthday. Until the day Nathan sent a letter. Not a text. Not a voicemail. A handwritten envelope, sealed with a trembling scrawl. Julia opened it when Matthew wasn't home. The words were short. Almost formal. "She deserves to know, one day she will ask. And when she does, you won't be able to lie forever. I'm not asking for rights. Just the truth. And a photo, please." She burned the letter in the kitchen sink. Watched the flames eat his handwriting. But something remained even after the ashes cooled. The unbearable thought that Nathan was right. One day Ella would ask. And what would she say? That her uncle was a mistake? That her father forgave too much? That her mother didn't have the courage to face the truth? Later that night, as Matthew read Ella a story and kissed her tiny feet, Julia watched them and wondered, not for the first time, if love could survive truth. Or if it only survived because of the lies we choose to keep alive.